Everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce Chengxin Jiang. So he has an interesting background where he did geology and tectonics for his undergrad and master's degree at China University of Geosciences in Beijing. And then he came to Australia to do his PhD at Macquarie University with Yang. And then he went off to do a postdoc at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And then he continued on to do another postdoc at Harvard University for a couple years. And then we were very lucky to have him, entice him back to Australia, where he started as a research fellow in my group at the beginning of 2020. And so he has a wide range of interests that span from tectonics to seismology. He's done work in the new volcanic province. He's gonna tell us more about volcanic imaging today, but he's also done some broader scale imaging at lithospheric scales, both in terms of across the San Andreas Fault, for example, and Alaska as well. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chengxin and let him give his seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks for coming. It's such a great pleasure. But first, I think I have to apologize because I have to actually shorten the title a bit because I don't have that much kind of time to touch on the sort of evolving state using sort of seismic noise. So most of the talk today will be focusing on how we use seismic noise to probing the internal structure of volcanics, particularly 3 volcanoes in the US. So here, the 2 photos shows 2 of them. So Yellowstone and Mount St. Helens. So I think these 2 pictures actually illustrates pretty well why people are interested in studying them. I think Yellowstone, most of the audience, I bet they have been to there. So I think when you are driving into this kind of national park, you'll be wonder, how this beautiful scenery is created, right? But the simple answer is that there's the magmatic system beneath it. So at the other hand, volcano is always dangerous. So the lower photo is showing the summit of the Mount St. Helens, which is actually mostly a result of 1980 eruption, which is actually the largest eruption in US history. So it caused about 57 people dead, a lot of economic loss. So, okay. Before I go into the details, I think I want to acknowledge my collaborators. Brendan Schmidt, my major collaborator at University of New Mexico. So I think when I was there, there are several projects on volcano imaging, or not only imaging, but also like seismicity, a lot of stuff about volcano studying in that group. So I get exposed to a lot of volcano seismology and get interested, and then that interest sort of carries on to my later careers until now. And other collaborators, including Fanchi Lin, Jamie Farrell, Kevin Wood from University of Utah. Kevin Wood was the postdoc, but then moved to South Dakota as a faculty now. And Jeff Abers from Cornell, who is actually one of the leading PI for the IMASH project, which stands for Imaging Magma under Mount St. Helens. So I'm using quite an amount of data from that, which is supported by the EarthScope and GeoPrism sort of fundings. And also, I would like to really thank Megan to have me here. She's so supportive, allow me to pursuing my interest. And we have also collaborations on a few sort of projects, either related to the volcanoes and Australia's sort of tectonics. So I think apart from the 2 volcanoes I have mentioned, Yellowstone and Long Valley, Mount St. Helens, the other volcano is called Long Valley caldera. So I think they have relatively one feature in common, that is they are mostly mostly generating silicic eruptions. So, but apart from this similarity, I think it has distinct tectonic settings. Here I showed their tectonic, showing the sort of Western US tectonics. So you can see the blue color here illustrates the major tectonic units. This is the Cascadia arc moving towards south as the Sierra Nevada. This is the Basin Range. Colorado Plateau is here. It's pretty active in the past 7 million years. and generating quite amount of like quaternary volcanism shown by these red dots here. But if you look at this three volcano, they are definitely different system, volcanic tectonic settings. Mount St. Helens, you have when the hookah plate is subducting beneath the continental US, so it's a kind of arc volcanism. Long Valley calderas, which sits right at the edge of the boundary of California and Nevada. So it's actually in a relatively bigger tectonic region called Walker Lane, which is parallel to the San Andreas Fault. So we all know that San Andreas Fault explains about 70% of kind of relative plate motion between Pacific plate and North American plate, while the rest 20% actually is accommodated by the Walker Lane. So Long Valley caldera is in this kind of one end of this transtensional region. Yellowstone is more kind of intraplate setting. We all know that hotspot. It's a typical hotspot track. It's created Snake River Plain, while the current hotspot track is probably beneath this region. So that's the tectonic setting. Apart from that, the volcanic size is slightly different. So Yellowstone and Long Valley are all very big. You can tell from their caldera size from the green line here. So the Yellowstone, to be more specifically, the most recent eruption happened about 600,000 years ago, creating about 1,000 cubic kilometers of debris, which is called Lava Creek, which is pretty famous in petrology geochemistry as well. Compared to Yellowstone, Long Valley is slightly smaller. It generates about 650 cubic kilometers, but still fairly large. So if you're using some kind of scales from literature, this will be all called super eruptions. Mount St. Helens is much smaller. So it has been periodically erupting in the past hundred thousands of years, but the most recent 1980 eruption creating only 1 cubic kilometers, but it's already creating like huge amount of damage. So sort of to give you a roadmap where I'm going in the right beginning, I think I'll just start with a sort of background why we want to study them, what we are studying, what kind of tools we use, and then I'll take you to the first case in the Yellowstone and Long Valley. It's relatively easy to start with the relatively larger volcanic system such as this two. So just for your reference, this study has been published in 2018. Then I'll move to the second case in the arc volcanic systems around Mount St. Helens. So this is all brand new results actually. I just get the results in about several weeks ago. So hopefully I can also get some feedbacks from you. Lastly, I wanted to use in 1 or 2 slides to see what I move, where I am moving, from here. So the first thing that I want to show is probably just this cartoon figure, but it's very simple, but it illustrates the major, interesting things a volcano probably have, right? So the first thing is the source. No matter what, the source is probably depending on the tectonic setting you are sitting on. But no matter what kind of settings, you generate pretty primitive kind of melts in the deep parts. And then this kind of melts because of buoyancy, because of the viscosity, and they get kind of, they move upwards. So once they get injected into the lithosphere, they can either be firstly erupted, or more often, they actually get stored and then do some kind of chemical differentiation, do storage. One chance is sometimes they may die because there's not enough heat or supply, or sometimes they do grow or stay for recharging for the next eruption. So I think in terms of sort of broad tectonic sort of questions, I think having imaging this magmatic reservoir in the crust has implications for us to understand the evolution of the continental crust. So think about the huge amount of hundreds, thousands of kind of cubic kilometers of silicic materials sitting there. It will definitely modify the sort of crustal column in terms of composition. So in terms of like hazard perspective, I think one question we would try to ask or answer is that how to identify the current life cycle of stage. So I think seismology can help us to understand some of them. So such as where and how much magma is stored right now beneath the caldera. So this is probably can help us to guide what kind of stage we are, and also what kind of geometry between this kind of magma reservoir for the transporting. Based on that, we can probably give some kind of quantitative information for some numeric modeling or related studies. Of course, seismic tomography has been one of the most direct approaches to imaging to study magmatic reservoir. So here shows the one pretty early study in 1995. So they used telescopic P wave, which has pretty steep kind of angle beneath the station. So it has relatively poor resolution in terms of like vertical, particularly in the crust. But this is actually one of the first study managed to put quite amount of like seismometers shown by these triangles here, very dense stations, short period array around the volcano, right? So what they have found that is that pretty concentrate velocity reduction beneath this caldera. This is all line. So if you look at the cross section, you see some maybe a relatively more pronounced kind of velocity reservoir in the shallow part, starting from about 8 kilometers to 16 kilometers, potentially with another one. So if you look at the velocity reduction, it's actually pretty strong, like goes to 20%. So at this kind of stage, they can estimate how much kind of melts are there. There's more recent studies in Yellowstone. So here shows the Huang et al. 2015 study. So what they have actually, in terms of technical part, is that they not only use this kind of steep geometry ray from teleseismic, but also adding some kind of, say, local P wave, which can travel horizontally for amount of time before it gets to the stations. So adding these two information together can really help to increase the resolution. So this is actually the first study sort of to imaging. There's 2 magma reservoirs beneath Yellowstone. So the shallow one has been imaged for a long time, but this is the first time they actually see, oh, there's actually another one. It's pretty interesting in terms of features. The shallow one is, they are different in sort of shape and size, and probably in velocity reduction as well. So they are actually relating this kind of different velocity reduction and the sort of depths to in terms of compensation, probably more mafic materials in the middle lower part compared to more relatively evolved melts in the shallow parts. So I think, simply speaking, seismic tomography can really provide us a good constraints now, on reservoir locations. The first order information, its geometry, and maybe give us a kind of bulk estimates on the volume. And we're still improving in terms of, because the technical innovations on that. But the things that, people, particularly volcanologists, will be really interested to know what is inside. I think this is probably what a magma reservoir should look like in a sort of volcanologist kind of point of view. So in this figure, most of actually the melts is probably not pure liquids. A certain amount of them are, and most of them are actually called marsh. So they are more kind of crystal rich. So this actually shows what the marsh is. So you have more than 50 to 60% of kind of crystals. So it more behave like a rock. So this is the viscosity. Once you pass this kind of in the marsh region, it's more like a solid rock, but it contains so much kind of melts within that kind of marsh. So in this kind of marsh zone, the melts can either be vertically a line, because the melt has to transport from shallow to deep, right? That's the sort of one pathway. Another thing is that the melts may grow horizontally, because they have to, when they moving upwards, they will lose the buoyancy and increase of viscosity. So they tend to grow laterally. So simply sort of to simplify this kind of system into 2 members. So we are asking the question, whether the magmatic reservoir is having a dominance of a dike structure. So most of the melts, it's like horizonting vertically with the interlayered with the host rock, or it is mostly like horizontal laminate kind of structure we call seals, right? unfortunately, like traditional seismic tomography cannot help us because of the, in order to resolve this kind of small scale features, we have to have super high frequency sort of energy, which is not usually available. And also you need to rely on very, very high like a density of stations, which is a lot of times not available either. But these two sort of magmatic features are corresponding up to a perfect kind of anisotropic. It's a pure, a perfect anisotropic system, which we can study by, not just to investigate the isotrope, but including anisotropy. So what is seismic anisotropy? It is just referring to the speed dependence on the direction. So this direction can either be the propagation direction. Say we take olivine, this beautiful crystal, one of the dominant the dominant upper mantle constituents. So if you shoot a P wave from left to right compared to the speed, another wave from bottom to top, you're probably generating 20% difference in terms of velocity. So that is propagation direction difference. So what I'm going to use is mostly the polarization, based on the polarization direction, which is from we're measuring two types of surface waves. And then these two types of surface waves give me different polarization velocities for shear wave. So Rayleigh wave, more specifically, if you have both surface wave, two types of surface traveling from left to right, Rayleigh wave is mostly vibrating in a vertical plane. So it's mostly sensitive to the vertical polarized shear wave. So the first V is the velocity, the second V is the vertical polarization. Compared to Rayleigh wave, the lava wave, again, traveling from left to right, but it's mostly vibrating in a horizontal plane. So it's mostly sensitive to the VSH. For a fully isotropic material, this two velocity will be exactly the same. But when it doesn't, it means there's like difference. That's the anisotropy. But a fully anisotropic material is very complicated to explain. We need 21 parameters to fully describe it, its elastic kind of response. So in order to simplify that, I assume a sort of hexagonal symmetry. So reduce that 21 to 5, and then you can using some kind of relationship, scaling the P and S. So I only having like two independent parameters in this case, which is VSB and VSH. Okay, so the difference of the VSB and VSH give you the anisotropy. So you may wonder what we are really to expect to see from the sealed dike structure. So in this case, we again gave two types of surface wave traveling from left to right. If you have a seal structure, the Rayleigh wave, which is sampling the VSB, will be reduced in terms of speed because of interruption from this kind of melt-rich layers compared to the VSH. So in this case, we're creating a positive anisotropy compared to the dike structure, which is totally opposite. In this case, the horizontal polarized shear wave will be more interrupted by this kind of melt-rich layers, so creating a negative anisotropy. So I think maybe it's a sort of good time to think it, if it is not intuitive, you may think it as a layered cake, whatever kind of cake you want. So they will be having different densities in these layers, right? So what I'm referring to here is that when you have a sort of more normal sort of a layered cake, you will have a positive anisotropy. When you have or vertical, or you threw it into someone's face in the birthday party, it'll generate negative anisotropy if the wave is traveling from left to right. Just keep this thing in mind because it's very important. So it turns out we are actually not the first one to study it. Sort of this early study in 2014 actually motivates our study a bit, and they are looking at the magmatic reservoir beneath the Toba volcano, which is in Sumatra, Indonesia. So in that region, it's relatively a narrow region. So it's they cannot get very big aperture of the ray. So they only manage to go to the depths of 20 kilometers. But they see this kind of interesting feature. So the VSB is for the other, showing in the upper panel, VSH is the lower panel. You see, about depths of 8 kilometers. So the VSH is much higher compared to VSB. So they interpret it as kind of a seal, horizontal laminate kind of structure. So, but interesting question that we want to further ask is that, does it really extend to, all the way to the crust, to the bottom of that, or not, right? So sort of summarize what kind of the scientific questions we really address here by studying this Sui volcano is that, do similar seal complexes exist beneath active volcanoes? Or the second question is that, is there any depth dependence? Such as at certain level there's more seal dominant, at other depths there's dike dominant, or a mixture. So this is all unsolved questions. So let's take you to the sort of method I'm using. So it's called seismic noise interferometry. I think it's a very popular method. You may already have heard it here and there, in the different kind of presentations. But just to give you a simple idea, if you have two stations, A and B, no matter where it is, it will always recording some kind of wiggles. When you don't have a big earthquakes, you may mostly recording some kind of small wiggles like this. But so this kind of energy is mostly caused by this kind of ocean waves, their interaction with the solid earth. So the interesting thing about this kind of two recordings that they're actually relatively weakly coherent. So that means when you cross correlate these two signals, you generate some kind of some useful signal we call empirical Green's functions. So what this kind of empirical Green's function means is that there's two lags, negative, positive lag. So the positive lag just means you like slash your hammer at A, you get a structural response at B. The negative lag will be vice versa. So this is only illustrating like a cartoon kind of point of view, but in reality, you actually need to have like long-term kind of recordings. But this is not a problem because a lot of times we have seismometers recording for years of data. So once you stacking all of this cross correlation between two stations for months, for years, you're generating this kind of empirical Green's function representing our structural response, which is very good. So another sort of powerful aspect of this technique is that you turn every receiver into a source, right? So I think this is a good cartoon sort of animation to show what it looks like by cross-correlating one permanent station in Colorado with the rest of continental array called US array, which is, each triangle here is a seismometer, or has a seismometer there. So by cross-correlating that, you can generate a kind of virtual earthquake here, right? Imagine like Thor is like slash his magic hammer on the Colorado plateau. I think it's a good scenery, maybe movie scenery to imagine. So you can see the energy is actually moving out across the continent, right? So just by measuring the time, in this case, we know exactly, how far it is for the energy to travel from the source to receiver, right? So we can work out the distance, the velocity very easily. So that's the basic idea for the method that I'm using here. So for this two, let's get back to Long Valley, Caldera, and Yellowstone. So each triangle in these two regions are a seismometer in that region. So I used about, quite a fair amount of them, pretty dense around Long Valley, not too bad along the Yellowstone. So they gave us this surface wave, two types of surface wave from this kind of technique at the period of 3 to 30 seconds. Again, but because of the time, I cannot go into details in terms of in terms of the methods. So if you're really interested, we can talk about later or in the Q&A session. One question that we want to ask during this study is that how significant the seismic anisotropy is at these two regions. So to answer that, we did actually two sets of inversions with a purely isotropic and purely anisotropic parameters. So on the left, you see the isotropic velocity. So that kind of feeding, or whether the data need the anisotropy or not, is illustrated by that kind of misfeed. We call chi-square misfeed in this case. So for the isotropic case, you generally, you're having a lot of like black and red color regions, which means the misfeed is really bad. compared to when you're allowing an anisotropy, it's going to, yellow to white, which is very good fitting. So particularly you can see this kind of, dramatic kind of reduction in terms of mid-speed beneath these two volcanoes, right? So we can further sort of zoom in to the Yellowstone. This is one case. So the observation is our radiant lava wave dispersion. So the sort of color kind of lines are our predicted kind of dispersions. You can see without allowing anisotropy, we are not fitting anything. But once you allow the anisotropy to play a role, so it gets to a mid-speed of, down to 3, which is significant, like a few out of 1 order of difference in terms of improving the data, improving data feeding. So that's indicating the anisotropy is significant beneath these two volcanoes. So without further sort of complication, I will just maybe show you the results here in terms of cross sections. So Long Valley caldera showing in one cross section from west to right, from west to east, sorry. Yellowstone, BB cross section from northwest to southwest to northeast, sorry. The upper panel is the isotropic velocity, the lower panel is the anisotropic. I think the first sort of order feature that will catch your eye would be the relatively concentrated velocity reduction beneath Long Valley and caldera in the relatively shallow depths. And interestingly, you see this blue blob from the anisotropic feature, right, which is confined by this kind of calderas. So just sort of to refresh your mind, that kind of positive anisotropy by the blue color here is indicating probably more kind of horizontal laminar kind of structure, the sill ones. Another thing that I want to mention here is that to plot the anisotropic model, I actually only plot the one we have like 95% kind of confidence. So it's kind of a way to remove the one we're not pretty sure about. But another thing is, you see this, we see a depth, we see a bottom of this kind of reservoir or the sill sort of structure, which is very interesting. And as I mentioned, in order to explain this kind of isotropic low plus strong positive anisotropy, I think sort of horizontal layered kind of sill structure makes a lot of sense in this context. But a sort of following question you may wonder is that, what is the composition of the melts? If you have a melt rich layer, what kind of composition would it be, right? So the two general options is that you have more evolved melts of felts composition. Another one is more primitive melts. I think our model in this study actually provides some kind of insights into that. So this cross section actually extends a little bit to this eastern part of the Snake River Plain, which is, particularly this one, the Heisey Plateau. You can think about this sort of shaded region as the Yellowstone, but in about 6 million years ago. Interesting thing is that if you look at the anisotropic feature, it's gone. So I think this probably indicating, one, the melt. So the anisotropic feature is indeed related to the melt. So once it kind of get cooled down, so the melt is probably sort of frozen, right? And in order to get it completely done, you probably would have more kind of, composition more similar to the surrounding host rock, which is more silicic in this case. So what we see beneath Heisey plateau is that after a certain amount of time, this kind of sill, more felsic rich kind of melts are crystallized, so they have similar composition, so to be relatively isotropic in this case. Sort of to summarize this part before going to the second one. So I think this cartoon figure here will say most of the points here. So I think we see in both volcanoes relatively similar depth range. We see strong horizontal fabric indicating by that kind of strong positive anisotropy plus this like melts indicate by the low velocity reductions. And then we think this is more indicating a sort of sill complex for the storage of magma in the reservoir. And we see a sort of transition into a pretty weak or some no anisotropy in the deeper depths. This may be caused by our resolution limitation, but more important. But it's also possible indicating a sort of maybe a sort of mixture of a sill and dike structure. Okay. So that's for the relatively bigger system like Yellowstone and Magmatic. So now let's move to the Mount St. Helens, which is much smaller magmatic reservoir. So we can get a sense from tomographic models for this. So I compare the Yellowstone. This is what you just saw. Its lateral dimensions about more than 100 kilometers or so. But in terms of the Mount St. Helens, you can see this is the P-wave tomography model at depths of 9. So this is the Mount St. Helens center, volcanic center. So if you draw a cross section, you see this magma reservoir in the shallow depths on the order of 10 to 15 kilometers, which is in order of scales smaller compared to Yellowstone. So instead of worrying about why this is much smaller, I think it's more actually seismologists and volcanologists wondering why there's even a volcano here at all. So if you take the Mount St. Helens is in terms of like big kind of a setting. So this is where you have the Mount St. Helens. This is illustrating the main chain of the Cascadia arc. So you have the Mount Adam here, Mount Hood. This is the Mount Rainier. So also plotted here is the sort of slab depths for the subductive and Hoover plate. So the main axis of the Cascadia volcano is at depths of about 100 kilometers. Mount St. Helens is much closer to a shallow depth, to the coast, to the trench. It doesn't seem that big difference in terms of location. There's only a few tens of kilometers sort of westwards in terms of distance, but it makes a lot of difference if you see from a temperature point of view. So this is a sort of maybe a sort of hypothesized kind of a temperature profile from the trench to across in the Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams, further to the Bagheart region. So you can see a few tens of kilometers close to the trench actually put you into a region which is very, very cold. So you can see that this is right the tip front of that mantle wedge. So the temperature will be a few hundred degrees C like lower compared to the general mantle wedge. So people has been wondering how would you get this kind of magma in a setting like that? So most of the people was actually suggesting the magma is probably coming from relatively to the eastern part and then somehow transport to there. So indeed, geophysics imaging actually provides some kind of evidence for that. So here I actually so here if you look at this kind of yellow shaded region, so there's Mount St. Helens, Mount Adam, Mount Rainier, they actually image a very high conductive region. They interpret as a melt. Right beneath the center of these three volcanoes. So this SWCC is called South Washington Cascadia Conductor. So they have to be sort of interpreted as using melts to interpret. Similar thing for sort of tomographic aspects. So this is a more recent paper in this region. They are looking at, so this shows the tomographic image at 20 depths. So you see a relatively concentrated low velocity beneath a sort of a center region of this kind of volcano. So they kind of showing you there's a kind of magmatic reservoir maybe feeding these three volcanoes at the same time. So in order to fully understand, that's why this IMASH project was initiated. So it has two components in it, active source component. So each star here is actually an explosion, and sort of the prestigious of this experiment is that there's more than 3,000 sensors around one single volcano. And there's a lot of interesting studies coming out of it. So if you're interested, you can just Google IMASH. There will be quite amount of paper. So this study, this kind of active source is studied, I think, conducted in late 2014. So it has been quite a years. Another part is the sort of broadband component. So this is a typical 3-component big sensors. There's about 70 of them covering most part of the Mount St. Helens, but also extend to the Mount Adams halfway through to the Mount Rainier. So that gives us pretty, very good kind of concentration of, in terms of sampling into looking at this kind of structure, not just look at Mount St. Helens, but, in terms of the volcanic system itself together. Also, in order to increase the aperture of the array, so we can see deeper parts of the reservoir, we also include many more stations, more than 200 of them, in terms of getting the signal from the noise. So there's quite many technical innovations compared to the earlier study in Long Valley and Yellowstone. But because of the interest and time, I cannot go into the details. So I think I would like you to trust me. I'm doing it in a reasonable well way. And here is the results. So isotropic and anisotropic results. So showing both in plane view and cross sections. So plane view, I plotted the isotropic velocity in terms of perturbation. So this is the color bar for it. Red means low, blue means high. So the right-hand side is the accompanied anisotropic. Again, positive anisotropy is shown by the blue region. And then what I also plot here is some lines which can guide us the region where we are very confident about their sign or the amplitude. And to depths from the plane view, we can see pretty high velocities around this kind of volcanic sort of following that trend of the cascading arc, which means it's probably the crystallized kind of material of the early eruptions in this region. There are some kind of relatively concentrated velocity reduction, around Mount St. Helens, but it's not very clear. But interesting, you see this kind of, to concentrate positive anisotropy here beneath these two volcanoes. When you go to deeper depths, it's probably more illustrating the current active volcanic system in this region. So you can see more concentrate velocity, more than 5% of velocity reduction. And again, interesting feature, this very strong velocity reduction is accompanied with a strong positive anisotropy. I think there's quite a lot of details because it's also some interesting features for the tectonic features, such as this kind of strong negative anisotropy here. You see it both in the cross section. So this cross section is along this. So you can see this kind of extending all the way from the coast to somewhere right around the between these two volcanoes. I think I'm not going to talk them into too details, but previous people have been arguing that they see relatively similar high velocity in this region, and they interpret this kind of high velocity region about 3.9 kilometers per second in terms of shear-wave. They interpret as a sort of oceanic plateau, which is probably I can go back to this one. They call it Silesia terrain, which is accurate to the continental US about 50 million years ago. So you see part of this exposed kind of oceanic plateau in some regions, but people was wondering where it is. So I think we are seeing maybe a boundary of them, but again, I'm not going into sort of too further in terms of that, but sort of focus your attention on the sort of magmatic system. So Mount St. Helens, Mount Adam again. This two cross section is actually from the same cross section, but with different kind of parameterizations. So the upper one is from an inversion where I include consider anisotropy also extend into the mantle, compared to the lower one which I muted the anisotropy. So I think this is just a sort of test to show, okay, what most of the features we observe is robust or not. I think, having these two tests, you can see the isotropic velocity doesn't change at all, right? There are slightly different, such as maybe the continuation of this like red blob, but most of the features actually almost the same, particularly this kind of relatively strong positive anisotropy beneath Mount St. Helens. Sort of, you have in terms of isotropic velocity, you see sort of connection here. while it's more pronounced in terms of anisotropy beneath the mount atoms, right? So I think maybe that's indicating sort of the similar thing as previous studies have been suggested, a sort of common shared reservoir in this region. So you can relate this model to many previous kind of studies. So here's the isotropic velocity in terms of the plotted as a perturbation. So I think if you compare it with the MT results, so in this case, the red region is illustrating very conductive regions like melts or fluids. So you can see generally you see a very similar feature. So just for your note, they actually plotted in a slightly different scale. So it's probably not very easy to compare directly, but that's actually the similar kind of depth of this kind of bottom guys. And this is more also more recent sort of P-wave to S-wave tomography in this region, extended to a bit kind of deeper depths using more regional kind of earthquakes. So you can see this reservoir. This reservoir is actually extending to a bit kind of deeper depths. So I think we see sort of hints of that, you know, beneath that Mount St. Helens, and then more probably it's related, you know, connect to the reservoir beneath Mount Adams. And if you relate this kind of anisotropic feature, again, regions where you see some of active melts, it's probably giving you this kind of similar horizontal line, you know, probably oriented horizontally to generate this kind of, you know, positive anisotropy. Actually, people has, even this recent paper was actually proposing that, you know, there are some kind of, you know, laminate kind of structures there. So I think is sort of, I think our model is probably a good support for that. So to summarize for this part, the Mount St. Helens and sort of surrounding volcanic system, I think they might share a middle lower kind of reservoir, and this reservoir is, you know, located further to closer to the volcanic, you know, main volcanic chain. So that probably, you know, helps to explain where that kind of reservoir or the melts is generated. And in terms of anisotropy, I think we see this kind of similar feature where you see low VS is coincident with positive anisotropy, suggesting there's sort of maybe layering, kind of horizontal layering structures. So I think in the next few slides, I would want to really summarize these two studies, sort of to give some, you know, implications. So I think the first one is that if you put them together, right, the Long Valley caldera in a transtensional sort of boundary, Yellowstone in an intraplate setting, hotspot setting, Mount St. Helens in a subduction setting, we both see this kind of, you know, interesting sort of positive anisotropy associated with, you know, melts. So I think it's indicate this, maybe the tectonic setting doesn't matter. It's what we are seeing here is mostly purely related to magmatic process. And so we can infer that magmatic sill complex may be a common feature for this kind of active silicic volcanoes in particular. Another thing is that if there's, you know, anisotropy is pretty strong, as we see here, more than 10% in most of the occasions, it actually affects our, you know, sort of when we estimate the melt volume. So a lot of cases, actually people tend to estimate the melt volume based on their vertical polarized shear-wave, that is a VSB, because this is much easier to derive compared to isotropic VS. So just give you a sort of idea how big that difference would be. If we take the Yellowstone as one example, and using a sort of relationship where you have the velocity as a function of melt fraction. So this is a particular system, like a granite system derived for the Yellowstone. So if you take what we observe in terms of VSB, it gives you about 10% of kind of melt, compared to 6% if you using the isotropic VS, which is the average of the VSB and the VSH. I think this makes a quite huge amount of difference in terms of, you know, melt volumes. So that actually, again, further impact your maybe, you know, assessing the healthy state of a volcano. Another thing that we are actually interested in, or like we want to further ask, is that, okay, now you have this kind of velocity reduction, you have a strong positive anisotropy that gives you a sort of indication, melt has to be layered somehow in a horizontal sort of, within the host rock. So the following question, which is kind of interesting to ask, is that, what is the configuration of that, right? If how the thickness of the melt-rich layer can be compared to, say, the host rock in order to explain the data. So I think we did a very, very simple calculation. So what we did is that we have two different kind of layers, melt-rich layer, melt pool layer, and then we can say how much kind of melt-rich layer can explain our observation. So basically I did, so this shows when you're increasing that layer 2, which is the crystal rich, which is the host rock layer in this case. So when you really goes into that kind of mushroom, you can fit in the observation well. So that makes a lot of sense, right? When you go to purely solid, that doesn't fit. So the rest of 3 figures actually showing what if we're having 60% of crystal rich layer, that's the white guy here, 70%, 90%. How kind of what kind of velocity or melt volume would we expect from this melt rich layer? So this gives you a sort of like you can see it's a very strong nonlinear system, but in terms of if you're taking like say 90% of kind of volume is melt pool, so the melt rich layer has to be much lower in order to compensate that kind of velocity reduction, right? and the anisotropy as well. So in this case, you have a host rock which can be 3.45 kilometers per second compared to 1.5 kilometers per second for the melt rich layer. So in this case, we're saying, okay, in a lot of cases, there's probably more melt within this sort of small layers, right? Not just in a 5 or 10% of melts within, distributed homogeneously within this. I think this has further sort of implications in terms of, the maintenance of the compositional heterogeneity for the magma reservoir. So you can see the seismic view, there's a strong kind of horizontal layering. If you have this kind of melts, a quite high amount of kind of percentage of melt in this melt rich layer and within this kind of host rock, you can first is help you to explain, because this sills can be weakly connected, right? So they may evolve on their own. So you can actually explain their geochemical signatures, distinct geochemical signatures for this kind of eruptive melt. And also you can recite, this kind of magmas can store at beneath the volcano for different kind of time. So that also explains. And more importantly, so this, if you have quite amount of like active melts beneath the volcano, so it can actually contribute to either a long-term magma storage or a sort of rapid contribute to a rapid mobility of the magma in terms of eruption. So I think the takeaway message that I want to share is that sill complex, hopefully I managed to convince you that sill complex may be a common feature for young silicic volcanoes, and this kind of sill complex can be a very good, reasonable mechanism to explain some distinct geochemical features and different residential time of magma, which you see actually on the surface. Before we really go to the Q&A section, I just want to use one slide to show where I'm moving forward. So in terms of just looking at, say, the bulk picture of that magma reservoir, I'm also interested in employing the dynamics of that. That's the temporal resolution. So again, that seismic noise is recording all the time. So we can actually get in that kind of empirical Green's function by days, by months, so we can compare them. So see the temporal variation of that. So we can monitor the volcano. So one ongoing work is at Long Valley caldera. Other things which I'm working on is that looking at volcanic system around Australia, we already data. We already have data. That's one of them is called Merapi in the Central Java. But also we are actually together with Megan. We're actually try to taking advantage of the new instruments from the purchased by the Oscope. That's the Smart Solo 3 component. It's like a geophone, but it's very compact. It's about 2.5 kilograms. It has everything in it: battery, GPS. So you can carry maybe 8 to 10 of them into one just by hands. So you can fast deployment. So I think we are trying to targeting different volcanic systems both in Australia continent as well as New Zealand. So the last kind of figure here is just show you the powerfulness when you have so many of these kind of sensors in around one region. So this is Long Beach array, which is more than 5,000 points, 5,000 sensors in a very small region, maybe a few kilometers by a few kilometers. So what really sort of make it powerful is that you are not just recording a sort of movement of surface wave of the ground motion in one location, but in every location. So that's the wave field of that. So this is actually showing a sort of small animation where the wave is actually coming from a earthquake very, very close to this array. And you can see within this kind of small array, you can already see this kind of, change of this wave field. If you, like here, right, you see this kind of breaking up of that kind of wavefront, which is caused by a sort of, fault systems. So without further, I will stop here and take any questions if you have. Thank you.
All right. It's always difficult without being able to hear audible clapping, but thank you very much. And if there are questions, then I just ask people first and foremost to identify yourselves by raising hands, and then you can unmute yourselves as we go through. So the first thing I'm going to do is allow people to unmute themselves. Okay. Any questions?
Seems all good. Yeah.
Very nice talk, very informative, thank you. What would it take to deploy an array of these things on the seafloor over a mid-ocean ridge?
Yeah, I think there are several potential problems. One is like the waterproof, right? I think this requires more kind of technology. Second is that you may have your problem with the GPS because you have quite certain amount of like water columns preventing you from transmitting the data. I think other than that, I think the third thing is that it's probably pretty hard to recover. But other than that, I think it could be a interesting idea. Yeah.
Yes, the reason I ask, of course, is you've been dealing with on-land silicic systems.
Okay.
There's a big group of people who argue about the longevity, the size, the shapes, the reality of magma, quote, chambers below ridges. And it seems to me that your techniques are the way forward, perhaps, with relatively dry magmatic systems, which may not necessarily be forced to crystallize on ascent, the way all these silicic systems are. But anyway, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Brad has raised his hand. Do you want to go ahead, Brad?
Yeah, I was just, I was wondering, I was noticing on your Yellowstone cross section that right up in the northeast, you've got that little red blob just outside the caldera.
Okay, let me bring
that would imply perhaps a dike swarm there outside the caldera on that transect.
This one?
The seismic evidence of that, say small earthquake swarms in that region that might support that?
Oh, just sort of to make us on the same kind of point. Is that which one you are looking at?
Yeah, just that red blob.
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah,
that's actually a really good question. So we see actually this kind of positive. So this is negative anisotropy in the relatively shallow depths. So if you let me just bring that kind of maybe the two here, right? You also see it at Long Valley caldera. So in terms of like negative anisotropy is probably mostly indicating a vertical sort of structures like faults, right? So in this case, we're not sure about it. There are definitely some kind of earthquakes here, but it's not just over there. It's somewhere like, you know, all around here. So it makes it pretty hard to, you know, relating this small feature to something we know actually. But I have actually a sort of plain view of this. So most of this kind of negative anisotropy along Long Valley caldera is actually concentrated at the fault systems, which I didn't mention in this talk actually. Yeah, so it's probably like vertical kind of faults, which sort of makes sense to generate that.
Nice, thank you.
Okay, that's good. Any more questions? Raise your hand.
I've got another one.
Literally raise your hand. Okay, go
Sure.
on.
Yeah, I have another one. Since you've got this Yellowstone image up, I would guess the average petrologist geochemist view of Yellowstone is that it's being fed at depth by uprising basalt magmas from the Yellowstone plume. And those invade the crust, melt the crust, and the rhyolitic, the felsic rocks are being generated by melting of the crust. But somewhere at depth, you'd expect some feeder system of sills, basalt vertical channels coming into the crust. Can your approach detect those, or are you overwhelmed by the, let's say, shallow sill arrangement at shallower levels in the crust? Can you see below what that big blue blob is?
Well, yeah, I think this is really great question. You know, I think of as you just mentioned, the melt has to come, you know, from deep to shallow, and that's the vertical direction, right? That makes a lot of sense. But that process may be, I think, in my point of view, based on this kind of, you know, colorful images, that they may be transient kind of features, right? So you, depending on, you know, where you sort of, you know, when that kind of happens, probably you miss a lot of times when it's not like transmitting, because you can basically see if there's like vertical, like sort of degassing or like recharging, you can see from the seismicity. Actually, in a lot of cases, you see them like in a periodic or like in a certain amount of time, but not all of them. So I think that potentially be explained by why there's mostly horizontal line in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So one of the things we can do, there are any students or anybody else out there who'd like to sort of carry on this discussion in a more informal way, I will stop the recording at this point so that so that you don't have to, so it is more informal. Okay.